Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. My name is Pallavi Garg. I am a staff attorney and the Criminal Justice Program Coordinator for Free to Thrive. And we're so excited to have everybody here for this extremely important conversation and knowing so excitedly that this is just first of many to come. So today we're going to talk about changing the narrative and recognizing the victimization of criminalized survivors. So this is a really important conversation, I think, as a society, as in America, in terms of recognizing some of the laws and how they can be better. We're all kind of starting to learn that victims of trauma, of childhood abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, human trafficking often find themselves in the criminal legal system and are not getting identified. So let's talk about that. And we're going to have a very robust conversation today about why some of these problems happen, how they happen, and hopefully talk about some solutions that will help us all. So it's so good to see everybody who's here, and I see that you guys are on from very different perspectives, also coming from different places, doing different things. So we really hope that having this excellent panel here today that is also coming from very different perspectives will really help us frame this conversation and give each of us something useful to walk away with and learn from. So today we're going to specifically address how to better identify victims and survivors when they go through the criminal legal system. So let me start by saying that at Free to Thrive, we provide legal services to survivors and victims of human trafficking. However, there's a huge intersectionality in some of these issues. For example, statistics show from the most recent study published by the CSEC court out of LA County, we know that even just in California, 1 in 5 foster youth is being vulnerable and is being trafficked, and we also see statistically that over 80% of our clients have also suffered from domestic violence and other types of trauma and abuse. So there is this huge intersectionality in our vulnerable population as they go through the criminal legal system. For that reason, this past year, Free to Thrive, we partnered with a powerhouse group of coalition. We had a coalition of powerhouse organizations, which helped us pass a bill numbered AB 124. AB 124 is going to address some of these issues that we're talking about. It'll hopefully help us better identify victims, at least in going through the system in the state of California, from a pre-conviction lens, a post-conviction pre-sentencing lens, and a post-sentencing lens with vacatur, which is record clearance, and in resentencing. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that bill specifically today because parts 2, 3, and 4 of this training series is going to be micro-focused on different aspects of that bill. So stay tuned for more to come. But before I turn over and introduce all of our awesome panelists, I'm going to start with April Grayson, who has graciously offered to give us some of her time here today. April is from the Young Women's Freedom Center. She's a policy associate and was one of the most powerful voices we had the privilege of having in our AB 124 coalition. So April, would you mind just briefly talking about your experience on working with the bill and how everything was?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your time today. April Grayson, Policy Associate. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. And 124 was interesting to say the least. For me, as a person who has survived every system in the state of California, to have to explain to the people who govern and run these systems how harmful their systems are, and to advocate for people who don't have voices, who people don't see. Um, it was an experience that gave me great power, and it allowed me to step into my brilliance. But at the same time, it was a little bit harmful. Honestly, it was a little harmful to ask people with power to see people as human beings and not as the labels that they have placed upon them. Um, I wouldn't change it for anything. Like, I would do it again solely because I know that everybody isn't allowed, or they don't allow themselves, or shame and fear sometimes rule and run these environments. And I would do it again because I know that there are still people who need their stories to be told. There are still people who need assistance. There are still people who didn't benefit from 124 who are still locked in cages. um, So as grateful as I am for the work on 124, there's still work to be done. And I will be here and advocate until people see people for people. People see people for people.
Perfectly said. Thank you, April. We were so grateful to have your voice in the advocacy for the past year. And I'm so also grateful that the two other panelists we have with us here are working on all of those things that April just talked about and really fighting every single day to protect victims and to get systems to recognize victims as they go through the system. So let me first introduce you to our next panelist, Kate Mogilescu, Professor Mogilescu, who is powerhouse attorney and professor of out of Brooklyn Law in New York, who has taken a lead nationally, created the Survivor Reentry Project, worked at Legal Aid for many, many years, somebody who I personally have been following since before I even came to Free to Thrive, back when I worked in Miami, who has been a powerhouse in getting new laws passed in New York and helping organizations like Free to Thrive around the country better advocate for their clients and for survivors and victims. So thank you for being here. And we also have with us Mary Ellen Barrett, Deputy District Attorney from right here in San Diego, who is, Mira, if you can go to the next slide for us. Thank you. Deputy District Attorney Mary Ellen Barrett is out of San Diego and has been working for the last 30 years to be a voice for victims and survivors in the criminal system, who is, I know, personally been a voice of reason and guidance on a many occasion, and is always, always having the conversation of how can we better see victims and get their experiences heard as they go through the criminal system. So 3 very, very different experiences. Thank you, Mira. I think we can take the PowerPoint off now and go right into our panel. I'm going to get us started. I hope you guys all learn from these 3 different perspectives. They may not always agree with each other, but they're all fighting to protect victims in their own way every single day. So with that, let's get started. Like I said, often victims don't get identified in the criminal system. So let's talk about some of the terminology, victim offender intersectionality, and what is it? Kate, can you get us started?
Sure. And this is meant to be sort of a more nuanced conversation, I think, than maybe some intro level or basic trainings about either trafficking, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence generally. This is where we get into some of the more complicated situations that present themselves. And we get into not only complicated situations, but the complexity of people's experience and people's experience who have been victimized, who have been exploited, and have ended up in the criminal legal system as a result of that. So as a starting point, I think where we are now in 2021, having this conversation, looking at bills like AB 124, looking at some of the legislation that we have in New York and other places across the country, so we've come a long way. When we used to think about the criminalization of survivors, well, actually, in most places, we didn't even think about it. But when we started to have conversations several years ago, it was really all of the beginning efforts were focused on the arrest and policing of prostitution, and the damage that we were causing in our policing of prostitution and the way the criminal legal system was handling prostitution offenses. And the initial round of laws and efforts in this area really focused on that, but that was limited. Right. It definitely was an issue, a phenomenon that was impacting a lot of survivors, people who had experienced exploitation and abuse, coercion, but it certainly wasn't capturing the full way that the criminal legal system was impacting survivors, which goes well beyond the way prostitution offenses or offenses involving commercial sex, the sale of sex, are handled. Instead, where we are now in this moment is pretty remarkable because we're able to have some hard conversations about who is prosecuted, why, what the harms we're really looking at, right? What harms, where there's interpersonal harm and when there's state level harm imposed on people by the very institutions that many think were designed to protect and prevent against harm. So victim offender intersectionality looks at that, and it looks at how people who have been victimized, exploited, experienced abuse can be arrested for a whole host of offenses beyond that which just immediately comes to mind, which is prostitution in the context of human trafficking, right? Thinking about the ways in which other offenses and people's arrest and prosecution and punishment for other offenses also can connect back to victimization, and pushing the conversation to say that the legal system has to offer more intervention points, has to offer more remedies, and honestly, hard, and probably we won't be able to do this in the next 55 minutes, has to like prevent this type of criminalization from happening to begin with. This is separate from, but certainly part of a larger conversation about mass incarceration and mass criminalization in this country. So I don't think that answered your question at all, but I might be out of time.
No,
So tell me.
that was a fantastic way to frame the broader picture of what we're here to talk about. So I appreciate it. You know, and we're talking about this victim offender intersectionality. And I know when we talk to folks, people are surprised to learn of the types of crimes that victims end up getting arrested for. So with that, let me turn to April. April, can you talk to us about two different things? One, can you talk to folks about what one of those crimes, which ends up being human trafficking when someone gets labeled as a bottom? And can you also talk to us about why sometimes victims don't self-identify themselves?
So if I tell my story as a woman who was incarcerated due to being a bottom, for those of you who don't know, the bottom is almost the glue to the foundation of the stable. I hate to say this, but I'm going to use the words that we use out, the words on the streets. So the bottom is the glue, and the bottom is the person that is the most, I believe, manipulated, because without her, he cannot have, and none of it will exist. And so for me as a woman convicted, I had served over 17 years in the largest women's prison in California, in the United States, because I was labeled as the madam and I was labeled as the mastermind. And I think it was easier because I was a woman, I was the most vulnerable, and I wasn't willing to give up my co-defendant. I was fearful. I didn't know if I was going to be able to go back to the streets after telling on him. And the manipulation of him telling me, like, I'm going to take care of you. I got this. Like, we're going to make it through this. And me still believing these stories. And then with the system not aiding, helping, not even trying to ask any probing questions, not even asking me, like, why are you here? I'm 19 years old. Mind you, today, the irony of it is today, 23 years ago, I went to prison. So I sit here today and I'm like, God, of all days, this will be the day. But nobody ever asks me, like, why are you here? What is your background? Where did you come from? Why are you 400 miles from home with this 27-year-old man and these women? Like, what's going on here? Because they wanted a slam dunk conviction, because it was a slam dunk conviction. People from the community, young people of color, a woman with no advocates, had already been through every system. And it's hard to self-identify because you don't even really know you're being manipulated. Like, I had no clue. In my mind, this is my boyfriend. This is a person who I'm building with. This is a person who has been here through every low level point of my life. Well, not every low level point, but in that point of where, like, we're living in the streets, we're young, I'm an unhoused person. Like, I have all these things going on. And here's this person who cares if you eat or you drink water. And then you have this system who has only shown that they're going to criminalize or harm people of color. You're not going to turn to them for help, because who have they ever helped that's not Caucasian or a person of privilege or a male? So it's just, they're not going to, even right now, like at the organization I work with at Cash, like we have women where they have to go through an extensive training to even identify as a woman who works for a pimp or who has a pimp or is even being trafficked by a pimp. Mine is, regardless of the abuse, regardless of the situations, they have to be around people who understand and who can talk to them without judgment or shame for them to be willing to identify. And our system isn't designed to allow us to identify.
Absolutely. And that, thank you for sharing your experiences, April. It's always so appreciated, for you to be here and for you to share your perspective and voice. And it's so consistent, sadly, right? With like so many of our clients who don't realize that they were victimized. And that's part of the criminalization, part of the psychology of the human trafficking crime of manipulating a victim when they become a bottom. Unfortunately, though, I know as a former prosecutor that oftentimes part of that initial crime is also that so much of the evidence exists against the bottom instead of the actual trafficker. So Mary Ellen, let me give you a minute to talk about that from the perspective of prosecution, what you see as the evidence and how you tackle this extremely complex issue.
Thank you. And thank you, April, for sharing your story. Because of people like April and survivors and thrivers and coming forward and telling their story, law enforcement has been educated. In San Diego, and we have a human trafficking task force, and just because the evidence all points to one person, if that person is also exploited, that's what they're looking for. And I hate to assume gender roles, right? Because anybody can be a trafficker and anybody can be a victim. But if it's a group of women that are engaged in prostitution, our task force goes in with the idea that they're all victims. Now, it might not work out, or I don't know, but I did check. And I know that when I started this 10 years ago, we had cases where there were the bottoms and they were being charged. And what we tried to do is do a good plea bargain and get some help and do what we could, but recognizing that the harm has already occurred, right? It's already on the record. They've already been incarcerated. That's already happened. I went and I checked our stats from January of 2020. And there's one case that was filed with a female. And that is there is no male, there is nobody else around, but right now there's been a hiatus put on that and she's in therapy. And so hopefully we can address that and make that one go away. But I think that's a huge difference. I also spoke with our task force commander today about that, and she confirmed what they go in and what they're looking at. And it's really, I will attribute it to them seeing the reality on the street, but also to survivors being willing to come forward and tell them what is really occurring.
It's good to see that at least some of the trains are starting to shift a little bit. The more we understand, the more we can do. April, I know we've talked about this. I know at least you and I many, many times, but you said earlier that nobody asked probing questions, right? Like nobody asked you, why are you 400 miles from home? What are you doing with these girls and this much older man? Can you give us an example or two of like at what stage during that process somebody could have asked something that you think may have made a difference?
I think at every stage, somebody could ask a question from from arrest. Like I was arrested with the SWAT team, the helicopters, the news camera, and they didn't ask, nobody knew any background or any history. Like, how do you put people on the news and how do you write these articles and these stories without knowing who you're talking about? When you get to the strip out, I'm sure I look like, I'll be 43 tomorrow. So I'm sure 23 years ago, I must have looked like I was about 15 or 16. How do you not ask a person who looks so young, like, how did you get here? Where's your mom? Where's your dad? Where's your parents? Who do you belong to? How do you not ask them? Then you get to arraignment. You have district attorneys, you have public defenders, you have attorneys, you have people, social workers, there are people everywhere. Then even after sentencing, you have to go to the social worker not the social worker, you have to do your probation report to see if before sentencing, you go to your probation officer, the probation report to see where they're gonna send you. Do you qualify for maybe a lower sentence? Nobody asked any questions there. Like, there were so many times somebody could have asked a question and there's no way that they didn't run my history. Like, there's no way that you didn't run my history and see that I had been maybe charged with prostitution in Los Angeles County. And what were you doing in Los Angeles County? Or everything has a trail. And for me, a person who's been, like, my first encounter with the system was at 16 years old, 15 years old, juvenile justice in Orange County. So there's a trail. There has to have been CPS trail. Like, they weren't doing their job. They didn't want to.
I definitely hear that. April. And I think, what I consistently hear from April and from other survivors is this concept of the question of why, right? Like, is missing. I think in this country, law enforcement wise, we've kind of moved towards uniformity and having these complicated mathematical systems of determining whether a crime happened and who committed it. And we've moved away from the humanity of why. And so I love the fact that each of us who's here today and bills like AB 124 are seeking to put that humanity back into the system and ensure that at the various stages, somebody is asking why, what happened, who are you, why are you here, and how can we do better? So with that, Kate, I want to turn to you to talk about why that's important. What are some of the issues that you see as a defense attorney, as a professor, as somebody who works with survivors and victims every day? What are some of the issues of being criminalized that you're universally seeing?
Yeah, and I think just to hear about the different points when anyone could have asked a question, it's important to keep reminding ourselves this, but it's also really important to know that we can't put the onus on people who are being victimized to come forward at the moments we deem appropriate, right, in order to prevent their own further victimization at the hands of the state. And so while, yes, questions should be asked all the time, we should constantly be questioning everything. Right? It can't be that someone has to come forward and say at these particular points, oh, I'm being victimized and now I'm ready to share, to tell you, to whatever, right? We have to have a real reckoning with the heavy machinery that's just put into place by virtue of an arrest, right? And like what flows from that. And so to hear Mary Ellen talk about pausing something, right? Putting something on pause, this is a concept that is really antithetical to the way the criminal legal system practices, right? We resolve cases quickly, everything's overwhelmed and overloaded, and there's not a lot of time to explore circumstances. And I just want to say that we have to move away from that as a whole, and not just make it about asking more questions of people and putting the onus then on survivors to come forward and sort of, right, disclose at the moments that we give them to do that. That being said, either way, when someone ends up being arrested and prosecuted, what that puts into motion are a whole host of consequences for them. April talks about 17 years of incarceration, right? That is what we're talking. We're talking about long periods of incarceration, surviving prison, a prison environment that certainly, if we think about what people who have experienced victimization need and we think about healing, well, prisons are not the place for that, right? So the prison environment, the experiences of particularly women incarcerated, right? That is one very specific harm that comes from this. And when we're not talking about just short jail sentences that pertain maybe to misdemeanor convictions, we're talking about years of people's lives. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
No, absolutely. I was just going to ask if April, if you also want to talk about some of the other harms and collateral consequences that arise from criminalization.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that flows then, reentry after incarceration presents a significant set of challenges for many people, right? Not only just a disconnection and resuming connection after that period of incarceration, but access to resources, limited by a criminal conviction in many ways, limited by supervision, parole, right? That, again, many courts and judges see as a helpful presence in people's lives, but really is an extended punishment and surveillance and control. For people who've experienced the power and control of trafficking or domestic violence, supervision in the community resembles that, right? There's a lot of ways in which that control mirrors exactly what people have been through. Criminal convictions impact, of course, housing, employment, immigration status. These are all the things we can rattle off easily, right? When someone has been convicted of a crime, impacts all of those things. For survivors who have been convicted of trafficking, so one of the things that we're talking about, many survivors are then also required to register on sex offender registries, state level, that further impose huge barriers to, just everyday existence, from dictating where someone can live to what contact they can have with family members and children, volunteer, work opportunities, and the stigma of being identified as an offender in that way. The registries do very little, if anything. I'm going to go out on a limb and say do nothing in terms of increasing public safety or minimizing risk, and instead perpetuate, right, these harms, these constraints, and these preconceived notions that we really, again, need to be pushing back against. And I could keep going with all the harms, but I imagine other people have a lot to say about it too.
I personally was a person who had to register for 3 years. And it was, I want to say, a week after I discharged parole that I had gotten a letter from the Department of Justice saying, oh, we're sorry. After an audit, we realized you shouldn't have to register. But I was scared to come home. Like, I was literally, oh, it makes me sad. I was fearful to come home because people are so mean. And and before I came home, like, I didn't even know I was a victim. I didn't know I was a victim until I came home and I ran into the executive director at Cash. And she was like, who's ever addressed your trafficking? Like, do you know you're a victim of trafficking? So I was coming home thinking I was this horrible perpetrator and that everybody was going to know where I lived and everybody was going to, because they tell all your business. And how was I going to, like, I was willing to, like, go work at no shade to McDonald's, but I was willing to go work at McDonald's and keep my head down and not have a life because I didn't want anybody to know. And then having to register, you have to plug this monitor up. Like, you have this big old bulky thing. They identify you, like, I want to say one leg is for one type of registration and another leg is for another. So people know, right leg registration is the sex offender registration. You have to go down to this building. It's just horrible. You have to register on by your birthday. So every October 21st, I have to go register or I'm in violation within 5 days of this. So you have to leave your job, go down, register, stand in this building where everybody's staring at you. I'm usually always the only woman there. Then for you to tell me, oh, we made a mistake. Oh, okay. So how many more people is this happening to? Like, for me, I was lucky. I'll say I was lucky because my crime was so old that I don't come and sit up in systems. Like, they usually check for 5 to 7 years. So because my crime was 17 years old, they weren't running me like that. So I was able to get jobs and I was able to move more freely than some people. But what about the people who don't have the grace that I have on my life? Like, it's sad. It's really sad for them. And then for ultimately it to be a mistake.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there are everything you guys have said, right? Like, horrifyingly sad consequences of us as a society not protecting victims when they should have been. And Marielle, I'm going to pass it to you with a hard one, right? Because you're in those shoes, right? Like, law enforcement and prosecutors are supposed to protect victims, and that's the job. So tell us about, the times when a victim is arrested for a crime that's not related, that the law enforcement may entirely miss or a prosecutor may entirely miss. How do you deal with that with your specialized training, and what tips do you have for folks?
Great, thank you. So it can happen in almost any crime, right? Now with AB 124, we can consider every crime. But what I've seen is fraud, mail fraud, and bad checks. I've seen embezzlement, residential burglary has been involved, of course, drugs, right? And violence against traffickers is there, vehicle theft. And so I really do think it can happen anywhere. And I've tried to train and to keep in the back of your mind, the why, as we were talking about, like why. one of the difficulties, of course, is the turnover in issuing and continuous training. But we have a prosecution subcommittee of the Advisory Council in San Diego, and we've developed a training video so that everyone, when they're new to the issuing unit, can watch it and can be informed on these issues. And that'll be an easier way and I think more effective way to train everybody and to have like whether it's on your phone or however anybody does it now, it would be on my bulletin board. Look for these things. You know, is she fearful of a man standing around? Did the robbery occur in a hotel room? How did they first meet, right? And that'd be the sex buyer, the trick rolls. To look behind it. And I have to give kudos to our legislature and the proponents of the affirmative defense. I believe because the affirmative defense exists, it makes it easier for me to talk to prosecutors and to say, you need to know this. This is the law, right? And it can come up at any time. And my office has, of course, we know Summer Stephan is a big proponent of protecting victims and human trafficking. Has been on her heart for years. But when I teach this in other places, said you know, you need to wake up that it could be anything, or it's a logical thing. If you have the choice between being out on the street and passing a couple of bad checks, what are you going to do? And I would posit everyone would choose the checks. So it just makes sense.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. Here's a tough one though, right? The affirmative defense, the vacature statutes, every state has some version of these things. However, they're all limited. Nobody has this like unlimited thing. Even in California, which has one of the more broader statutes for vacature and affirmative defense, it still only applies to nonviolent offenses, right? And we know for a fact, like for example, April's case would have not qualified, right? Like it would have fallen under a violent offense because human trafficking qualifies as a violent crime in the state of California. So we know we're missing this huge piece, and it's preventing relief for a lot of victims. So when you get those tougher cases, Mary Ellen, where you can't use the affirmative defense, vacature as a law wouldn't apply, what advice do you have? And what do you think prosecution and even defense attorneys in those cases can do better?
Finding out the background. And I recognize Kate's point on not expecting the victim to give all the information. And that makes a lot of sense. But like with April's case, April said she touched a bunch of systems. Well, that's documented, right? So then let us know someone's been in the foster system, and with the prostitution conviction, I mean, it doesn't take that much to put two and two together, right? And to look at it from that lens, as well as I'm so lucky in San Diego that we have groups from like Free to Thrive and Generate Hope and North County Lifeline that will go in and assist victims that are still incarcerated. And if I know that they're being assisted by like North County Lifeline or Free to Thrive is involved, well, that gives me an idea of what's really going on. And that's without the victim saying anything in court, anything to their attorney, anything. And then we can hopefully do something in fashioning like a sentence, like Kate was saying, right? And everybody's been saying it needs to be individualized, and we need to be able to give help to those that need it. And I think many more than we've been recognizing need the help, could use the drug rehab, can use the psychological counseling, whatever it is, whatever they need.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. Kate, let me pass it to you from the perspective of being a defense attorney. What are some of the things that you think attorneys, when they are speaking to their clients, doing that initial conversation and interview, can do to maybe help identify what their clients have been through and advocate for it better?
Yeah. I think this all comes down to sort of just a willingness to listen and learn and create relationships that allow for this. And there's no one formula for that. And every practicing attorney is going to do it differently based on their temperament, their approach. Some really probably shouldn't be doing it at all. But but, you know, thinking about opportunities to create connections. And when you're working with someone who's being prosecuted in our criminal legal system, you just have to recognize the level of marginalization, and just the expressive value of that for people, right? So no, people shouldn't be excited that we're all of a sudden asking them questions, like, right? They shouldn't be grateful for that. They're facing a potential loss of liberty and in a system that is hostile to them. And so I think just recognizing that as a starting point is very important for both prosecutors, attorneys, judges, anyone working within the criminal legal system. Showing people, this is, again, this is not rocket science. It's the same way you would form a relationship, I imagine, in your personal life, right? Not over-promising, being genuine, being not co-opting language or terms that you don't understand, that you may have heard at a training once that you now think you own, right? Like being who you are, but coming at it with a little bit of humility, curiosity, and openness. And just being able to recognize and absorb the harm that is happening. And once you do that, I believe the conversations change, the tenor of the conversations change. People that we work with as defenders have experienced not only systems, what we've been talking about, right? Like multiple systems, they've experienced really bad lawyering in those systems as well. So you're working to undo that, coming at it as a, you know, in a different way, and recognizing that, like, you know, if people have bad experiences with a particular field, the medical field, I always draw analogies. So, right, like how we're treated in a hospital, how we're treated and across systems, like, the next doctor that comes in the room, you're going to project that stuff on it. So bad lawyering lays the foundation for a lot of this. And people have been exposed to bad lawyering, bad social working, bad case working throughout their lives in many instances. So we need to ask questions, obviously, but we need to come at it with a little bit of a different approach. Many lawyers are trained, and I work in a law school, so I can say this, that they have particular expertise. I don't know. Like, I mean, can we read a law? Maybe. I hope my students can by the time they graduate here, but we're not the experts of people's experience. And so if you go into it thinking this is a top down, like, I'm going to tell you. And sometimes we're reduced to that because we're forced to sort of navigate plea bargaining structures, sentencing minimums, sentencing laws that don't allow for room. So sometimes we come at it from a very sort of mathematical perspective of risk management, right? How do I get you the lowest sentence? And that seems kind of almost like a formula or an algorithm, but we can acknowledge that and be a human being in that. So recognizing that what we bring as attorneys, not all that special, and that the person that we're working with actually has the expertise as to their experience, what they've been through, what they want to be part of their case, what they might be willing to share with you, but don't want to be part of the case, which both things are okay, that allow you to collaboratively then build a case plan and a strategy to move forward.
That was such a helpful answer. And I know I'm kind of slowly taking us into our solution section. So before I do that, I do have one question for April specifically. And I also want to tell our audience members, we're definitely going to save some time for your questions. So please throw in the Q&A any questions you have for any specific panelists or for us generally, and we'll do our best to get to them at the end of our conversation. April, before I take us into some proposed solutions, tell us a little bit about, we've been talking about charges that may on the onset kind of look unrelated to trauma and victimization of various types. Can you tell us a little bit about why some of these charges may exist? Like, we're talking about check fraud, we're talking about different types of crimes that somebody may not put two and two together very quickly. Tell us about how some of these crimes even come about from a victim's perspective.
So ultimately, when you're working under a man, the goal is about getting the money. And as long as you're getting the money, like, that's how you stay unharmed. You stay with the things that you need or that you want because you turn over all your money to this person. So, like, for me specifically, I could have been arrested for a number of things before I was arrested that day for pimping and pandering. I could have been arrested for selling drugs. I could have been arrested for fraud. I could have been arrested for possibly robbing people, because it's about the ultimate goal is giving this man your money, and by any means necessary. And every woman that is being harmed or manipulated for a man isn't always a sexually related thing. Like, we have people every day, we have a vulnerable population, like the Social Security, the people who get Social Security, they are highly exploited for their money, for their small Social Security checks. But people don't pay that attention because it might not be a sexual related thing, but exploitation, especially around money with vulnerable populations. So it's all about getting money and giving it to this person, and by any means necessary. And if this person tells you to go in the bank and go run these profiles, you're going to go on the bank and go run these profiles, because at the end of the day, you do not want to get hit, and you want to be inside, and you want to be warm, and you might not want to go out to the blade and go work. So if it's easier for me to go run this bank money than to go out and have to go sell my body, sorry, but I'm going to go to the bank. And we're talking about a 19-year-old manipulated person whose brain isn't developed, whose emotions are developed, who has never been validated in their life. They're going to do whatever this person is telling them to do.
Thank you, April. That's just so powerful, right? I think like once we kind of understand that underlying vulnerability and that underlying basis of why somebody can get manipulated and how somebody can get manipulated, we can start to hopefully connect some of these dots that we usually don't. So with that, let's turn into a detailed conversation about some proposed solutions from each of your perspective. How can defense attorneys do better? I know, Kate, you talked briefly about that, and so you already kind of got us started on that conversation. I want to take some time to talk about the different steps of the criminal process and how identify a couple of spaces in each process where we think folks can do better, whether it's a cop, whether it's a prosecutor, whether it's a defense attorney, whether it's a judge, whether it's a witness, whatever you guys can think of, we want to hear some ideas. So Mary Ellen, do you want to get us started on that one?
Sure, I think, and I think Kate already said this, education, right? And I would go further to even go upstream to stop this from starting, right? Let's get the prevention education into the schools, like we do with drug education, like we do with dating violence. Let's talk to people, perhaps then they don't fall for the manipulation, right? And so then we can reduce the numbers. But I also think it's very important to educate, like I said, to educate the prosecutors and to educate the police, which we are out there doing. And again, there's turnover and people move on, but to stay at it. And I would add, not just educating them about human trafficking and how that leads to victimization, but what I would have liked a long time ago when I started, 30 years ago, I did not know the collateral consequences of a conviction, right? That wasn't something, and Kate, like you said, in law school, right? You think maybe you got the answers, but you don't. I didn't know that. And I didn't know the full extent until I started seeing the witnesses on my cases, my survivors who couldn't get housing. And that led me, to more questions. And then, as we all know, Kate Brainer from our public defender's office was wonderful and took the time to school me on it. And so now I do bring that up. But I think, to Kate's point, like when you're making that offer, I think you need to know that it's not just 30 days, it's 30 days plus probation, right? And somebody checking up on you, or this registration or this conviction means you can complete it, live a law-abiding life, be the perfect citizen, and now you can't volunteer at your kid's school. What have we done? What crimes are worth that now that child is suffering because mom can't be there, right? So, but it all comes back to know, the more you, what is it, Maya Angelou? When you know better, do better. And I think that's what we need to do.
I love that. You covered so many different things in that, and I want to parse them out a little bit. Kate, do you want to talk about that a little bit? And then I want to ask all of you some more pointed questions about it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think So one is to allow ourselves to move away from the harsh punishment paradigm, right? What crime is worth that, Mary Ellen asks, and we really have to ask that question. Sentencing in this country is crazy. It's absurd how long we incarcerate people for, and it's not just about survivors. I mean, it's about just the approach in this country, and so we have to just deal with that and really reckon with that, and then the collateral consequences, of course. I just want to make sure that as we do kind of highlight and emphasize the work that's going into local and state legislative campaigns and successes, we need to be bright-eyed about some of the pitfalls also, and the things we absolutely must insist on. So for example, to our earlier conversation about the different points where questions can be asked or relief can come, we want to make sure that we're not offering relief at one place to the exclusion of another. So it's not that you have to disclose at the beginning of your case, otherwise, right? And seek an affirmative defense, for example, and this is not the case in California, certainly, but something that we're worried about is that if you don't pursue an affirmative defense or disclose what's happening fully at the time of your prosecution, which many people just simply cannot do, that you're then prohibited from any kind of criminal record relief or post-conviction relief. There needs to be, right, like different points at which we're offering a changed approach, and it can't be one to the exclusion of the other. So it cannot be that if you do something, for example, or don't do something at the time of your initial prosecution, that then you're precluded or forbidden from seeking relief after you're convicted and sentenced. One of the problems, like we have a very promising law in New York called the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, and AB 124 pulled some pieces of what we had done in New York. But we should be ashamed that we set up the sentencing reform of the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act in that way, where moving forward, you must seek an alternate sentence at the time you're first prosecuted. You cannot apply to be resentenced moving forward. There is a resentencing provision, but it's for people who were already sentenced before the law was enacted. That's very limiting. So we have to push back against that, I think, very strongly.
That makes complete sense. And, we're glad that you told us about that when you initially kind of gave us your wisdom as we were drafting AB 124, because we made sure to avoid that language and make sure it was as broadly applicable as possible. And it's still not perfect. Like we said, it doesn't include all crimes. It doesn't include a lot of folks who are, have served long sentences and should be eligible for vacatur and record clearance, or are still serving time and should be eligible for resentencing provisions, or should be allowed to at least use the affirmative defense and allow the prosecutor to pivot the investigation and look into the full set of facts that may not have initially come up. So there's still so much work to do across the nation when it comes to providing relief and providing better understanding in the system. April, I know you've already talked about it a couple of times, but do you have any other pieces that you've thought of or that you would like to share about the different stages and where somebody could pointedly do something differently and that could be better for survivors and victims?
As I'm sitting here thinking about the issue that we have, and the issue that we really have is that we as a society have an idea of what a victim and a perpetrator look like before we even see a victim and a perpetrator. And victims in the United States are white women, period. I don't get the opportunity to be a victim. I might now because of the privilege that I have with the people that I know, but I would still get arrested and then my people would have to come save me still. So I think the conversation really has to open up to who are victims, who get to be victims, and why doesn't everybody get to be viewed as a victim? Why? Why do we only have it a certain way? And it's rooted in racism, it's rooted in slavery, it's rooted in some stuff that happened hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but we still, we're so progressive, but we're not so progressive because a lot of these laws are still on the books. And a lot of this antiquated thinking, like we haven't moved past who is a victim. And it's not just white women of privilege.
I could not agree more. I think we not only see that every single day, but at this point in our history and in our evolution as a society, we've seen the numbers, we've seen the statistics, we've seen the studies, we've seen the reports. Undeniably, those are all true facts. right? And every single year, a case gets highlighted nationally that leaves the other 100 behind, that highlights that fact and continues to highlight that fact. So April, thank you for moving us into, and I know Mary Ellen, you briefly talked about it, into this conversation about root causes. One of the things that I also wanted to hear from you guys on, and I know people are posting questions, so thank you. We'll try our best to get to all of them. We do have time. Is also about the history of policing in this country, right? Like one of the root causes when it comes to the criminal legal system specifically is like kind of this evolution of how law enforcement is trained, and like when we kind of moved away from long-term investigations and started putting resources into these short-term, you know, you can beat the charge but not the ride mentality of quick vice operations, which then turn not just to narcotics, but also to prostitution details across the country, right? Like almost all big police departments do it and are now starting, thankfully, to all, you know, trainings such as the one Mary Ellen was talking about, slowly starting to shift out of that model. But from your experience, what information, what opinions, what thoughts do you have on that? Yes, thank you, Mary.
Sure, I'll jump in. I really think it goes back to education. I know there's still pushback in other parts of the country that this is, you know, that prostitution is looked at as a victimless crime. It's a vice, it's not a crime. And just getting over that. And I would cite the survivor voice again. That's more powerful than me, right? I can go and try to quote a survivor and tell them, and I've done pretty well in San Diego, in Southern California, but I know in the other parts of the country, it is not as well received. And one of the issues I think is for the police departments is the numbers, right? They are expected to produce X number of arrests or you're not working, right? It's used as a measure. So that needs to be looked at differently as well, that you don't need to, and we work with that with the Human Trafficking Task Force. The fact that you have 12 arrests in a year might be the best solution. You don't need 120. And I would just like to know, with the Human Trafficking Task Force, they've shifted away from all of those operations where they go out and buy or arrest a bunch of sellers, right? That is not their mode now to do that, because they're recognizing the victimization. And again, why start the criminal process? I know that in some areas, oh no, arrest her or him, and then she'll flip, right? Then she'll testify against her trafficker, because now you're holding that over her head. And no, that's just trauma on trauma, right? And then aren't you just exploiting that person too for your own effect? So we're working to get away from that, but it needs to be a cultural shift. And I think getting away from you need to have X number of numbers, or we're not going to, you know, fund you, or we're not going to say that you're doing a good job.
I completely agree with that. Kate, do you have any additional thoughts on that? All right. I also want to ask you guys a little bit about any advice you have for the folks who are here on preparing materials that can be, you know, from the defense perspective, that can be given to prosecution. As a prosecutor, materials that you would like to receive that may change things, to give folks some ideas on when they're speaking to clients, when they're speaking to victims and survivors, on how to better advocate and prepare.
I'll jump in, and then hopefully Kate can add to it as well. Like, my dream case comes in with, as April said, all the systems that got touched and the evidence of that, but like a one-page thing up front that just says, boom, boom, boom. This is what was going on. And the proof or the corroboration behind it. I think that makes it easy. It makes the readiness conference, the let's make a deal DA, be able to look at that. You know, once you have credibility with the court and with other DAs, you know, if Kate gave me something, I probably wouldn't read the corroboration, right? Because I would know it was all there. And then we can move faster to get the right result.
Yeah, I think that, and this is, we don't ever want this to hinge on one person or one specific, right? Like, we're trying to build institutional responses that allow for this. And so, right, so it is it starts with one person, one relationship, one practice in a jurisdiction, and then it's hopefully spreads. So a couple of things about what we can provide to prosecutors as people working with people who are being prosecuted as defenders and as social workers, advocates. One is you must give control of that question to the person that you're working with. So I make clear to every single person that I'm working with that I'm not going to share anything that I find, that I track down, that we request, that we put together without them vetting it. They get final approval. They see exactly what is going into a prosecutor's office, so they know. And we talk about what that information might be used for. So this is not the kind of thing that can happen just by attorney alone writing something and getting it to the prosecutor. That would be a bad practice and would be very harmful. So I also explain to the people that I'm working with that I try to get as much as possible. And we don't know what we're going to use or not use. But for many people who have touched as many systems as a lot of people who've experienced harm have, you actually don't have a lot of that information. You don't leave each system with a neat summary of your records and where to get information and where to get proof of anything and what actually happened, right? So gathering information it can be powerful, and just providing that to the person you're working with, whether or not it ever makes its way to Mary Ellen or any other prosecutor, but just helping go back and recreate what happened here and what information exists out there about me and my experiences. For many people that I have worked with in this kind of backward looking process, looking at child welfare records has been illuminating, hard, awful, frustrating, painful. I mean, so many things, but illuminating, and paved open a chance for some real reflection on that. And in some cases, I dare even say healing. And this is information that, again, is not readily available to people, but going back and gathering that and understanding what you survived through these records can be we can change the way that it feels. So getting information, giving it to the person that you're working with and allowing them to have control over that is a key principle, I think. When you do share something with a prosecutor or a court, thinking about how that information travels as well. So in New York, when we share information identifying anyone as a victim of a sex offense, we have a law that says that the court cannot disclose the identity of that person, right? That the victim's identifying information must be kept confidential. So, but there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that clerks and the people handling actual papers know that and understand that, so that things aren't part of a public record that can be obtained by anyone, media, people who are trying to cause harm, family member, whoever it is, bad intentions, good intentions, we don't care. We just don't want people to access information that is personal and confidential and sensitive for people. So thinking about that, we do, like I said, we cast as wide a net as possible. And some of this is resource intensive. So for some practitioners who are on their own or in defender offices that are not well resourced, it's going to be an issue, right? Doing these records requests, tracking down old documents, working with people to kind of go back and recreate where information might exist is labor intensive. There is not a single situation though where we've done it, where we've regretted it, right? Particularly if you're doing it with the idea that this is this person's information and they should have it, whatever we end up doing with it as it pertains to their prosecution or their criminal case.
I agree with all of that. I think that's very consistent with our experience as well. And also asking the ACEs questions, the 10 questions that kind of create a baseline, also helping identify what records to collect, right, based on different things that are identified through that questionnaire. April, do you have any thoughts about speaking to attorneys, speaking to folks from their perspective, from your perspective, that you think may be helpful? Things for attorneys to remember or law enforcement to remember when they are interacting with people.
I have nothing really positive to say. I would just hope that they know that, especially if they're working with people from the community who are people of color, that there's a distrust there, and that when you are working with that person, like, they already do not trust you, and they don't trust anybody else, period. Like, they trust nobody, because they have probably survived things that most people wouldn't survive. And just to really like understand that there is a distrust, and to look at it through that lens, because I think a lot of times they want us to act a certain way, or they want us to be a certain way, or they want us to look at them like saviors or something. And you can't look at a person who has caused so much harm, systems that have caused so much harm, as saviors. And it's not about saving anybody. It's about humanizing people. So I think just really them just seeing people for people, and just realizing that anything that has said or that they do is not a personal attack. They just do not trust them, because systems are the things that have harmed them. It sucks, because when I look at I still have an issue with a lot of this stuff, because like 124 didn't apply to me after I spread my heart across California. And the same people who I spoke to didn't pass it, and they put the amendments in. So I struggle, because I know that we're having this conversation, and we're shedding light on this issue, but we still have such a long way to go, because it's a heart issue, and some people aren't ready to tap into their heart and how they view people. But I'll just say that just see people for people, and just realize that they're not going to trust you, and they might say some offensive things, and don't take it personal. They didn't get there because life was a walk in the park. They're there because life was fucked up.
I appreciate that. You're 100% right. We have such a long way to go. And just as a society, to understand that all victims and all survivors need to be protected. And our laws need to reflect that systemically. So somebody had asked for Mary Ellen, and I think you already talked about this, what kind of policy work is being done amongst law enforcement agencies and prosecutors to reduce what's criminalized in the first place, so future survivors don't have to deal with the results of having a record. And I know you briefly talked about the work that's being done in San Diego and the task force here, and the pivot that they have made to make sure that the initial investigation doesn't start with identifying and going after victims and then waiting for them to turn, but approaching it differently. Do you have anything else you'd like to add to that question?
I'm not aware of any like prosecutor created or law enforcement created bills that would reduce what is charged or would reduce crimes. And I'm embarrassed to say I'm not sure which ones we're supporting right now, but I know as far as a policy system, like the old way of doing business just isn't effective.
Yep.
And it's not just, but it is not effective. So the community policing and getting away from the draconian sentences is where we're headed, and that's where policing is going.
Thank you. We have a second question here for everybody, which says, someone mentioned there being no best practice or model statute that states are using to help survivors with criminal offenses. What are the panelists' thoughts on what either that statute could look like, or implementing that statute broadly would look like? Kate, do you want to get us started on that one?
Sure. I mean, I think that this is a difficult thing to create a model on, because state criminal statutes are so specific and particular. And so language that would make sense in one jurisdiction doesn't necessarily make sense in another, but there are a few key principles, I think, and we've talked about them already today, which is, what are we talking about? We're talking about sentencing, like freeing ourselves from mandatory sentencing, and so flexibility in sentencing, and making sure that there are no exclusions that will continue to limit our ability to actually move forward here. So whether that's offense exclusions, some things, violent, non-violent distinctions that really have just like no bearing on eligibility for relief or reduced sentencing. Thinking about procedural limitations, and like that's going to be very different state to state, but making sure that we're not creating unnecessary obstacles within pathways to relief. And then thinking about, again, relief at each part of the process. So what are our affirmative defenses look like? What do our sentencing alternatives look like, right, where a conviction is not avoided? And to Mary Ellen's point, like, what are our plea bargaining restrictions that we treat as gospel, but really don't need to be, and then of course, after someone has been convicted and sentenced, Can we still modify and reduce a sentence? Can we still vacate a conviction? Can we get people off registries? I mean, in too many instances, in too many states, registration is lifetime. No ifs, ands, or buts, right? So what are we talking about there? And what are we doing there? So recognizing for your state, each of these points, what does it look like? What's in place already? And where do we need to move? We have examples of criminal record relief statutes that we think are better shaped, better, considering all these factors. We don't have the gold standard yet. We have a bill in New York that our legislature passed this past session that is awaiting the governor's signature, that as it applies to criminal record relief, to the ability to vacate convictions, would fix a lot of issues in our state law. And I think a lot of the states that passed laws in the last 10 years about criminal records and for survivors are going back now and trying to see, okay, this was a start, but what do we need to fix? And so that's again, a conversation that the Survivor Reentry Project, which is a project I'm a part of at Freedom Network USA, that looks at the issue of criminal record relief, would be happy to talk to you about in your jurisdiction, like what makes sense, what doesn't, where do we need to go, because it is so specific to state law. One more thing, sorry, and that is we've been, because this is a California focus here, we have not talked about federal law and people who are prosecuted federally. And one place that this issue plays out over and over and over again is in the federal system, right? So victims who are prosecuted federally, many times for trafficking offenses, but in a lot of cases for the other types of offenses that we've been talking about here today, where the sentencing is also extreme and the consequences that flow, there is no federal remedy at any point for this. So even the promising things that we're seeing on the state level that we understand need to be improved, but are starting points, we do not have that at the federal level. So survivors who have been prosecuted federally, survivors who are still in prison, in federal prison, and survivors who are dealing with all of the things we've talked about after serving a prison sentence have no remedy. So we need to get on that.
Speaking of getting on that, we actually got a question specifically to that from Brent Woody out in Florida, that there is a federal expungement vacature measure now attempting to be back in the works, and hopefully we'll get some relief passed. In the meantime, and I think you answered this question, but I'm going to ask it explicitly, has there been any success from what you guys have seen in dealing with federal prosecutions of bottoms in terms of post-conviction relief, I guess, in terms of stipulation and understanding rather than having a legal relief present? I'm assuming, Kate, your answer is going to be a strong no, but unless you've seen anything and have any advice for anybody who does have federal cases in terms of anything you've seen that has worked.
My answer is a no, with an asterisk, which is that we're still trying to figure this out. So we're looking at legislation like the First Step Act, which was passed in 2018 on the federal level, right? That is about release and sentence reduction, to see, is there a path that we can carve there for survivors? And we're trying. I think it's going to be a tough approach, right? And I don't know how we will fare. And this is not to say that we're experimenting on the backs of survivors, but we are trying anything we can to bring people home from prison and to elevate this issue. So that is one thing. I think that any effort on the federal level will have to be really, really earlier versions of bills that would actually give survivors a way to move to vacate convictions on the federal level have not prevailed, right? Not been successful. And I think we need to rely on the expertise of those who practice in the federal system and make sure that, again, we're looking at guidelines. We're looking at like the specific practice within the federal system to create this, just the same way that I was giving that answer as it pertains to the states, we need to do for the federal system. There has been one presidential pardon of a trafficking survivor. And at the state level, we've had like a few extensions of executive clemency, but not nearly enough. And that's the thing that could happen tomorrow, right? In any state or at the federal level, clemency could happen tomorrow, but we haven't seen it.
Yeah, I definitely agree that that is a huge thing. And I know we only touched on it for 1 second, but like another thing I'd add to that list of principles you shared for any model statute or law would also be, being aware of criminalization consequences with any state statute, federal statute, right, on how it impacts somebody's immigration status and their ability to stay, because U visas and T visas don't always work for everybody, and can be slower in certain administrations than others. Mary Ellen, April, do you guys have any thoughts on any other principles or guidelines for when somebody is considering what a model statute should look like, of things that should be included?
No, I'll leave the model statute with Kate's expert advice. One thing I would like, and it's in the domestic family court law, because we're still getting cases where custody just decided against the victim because of what the victim's engaged in, and custody is being given to the trafficker, which is just yet another control mechanism. I know we've done education here in San Diego, but my understanding is it's still occurring, and I would like to see something that would stop that.
1000% agree. Yes, go ahead, April. Thank you.
I think 124 in its raw form was beautiful. Like the way we crafted 124, to take every aspect of people's lives into consideration, and we created a beautiful piece of legislation that would look at people for people, regardless of what they were involved in, if they had any history of trafficking or domestic violence. And now that the bill, it was amended to the point that it took a lot of that out, or it only applies to a very small percentage of people. But if we go back to the foundation of 124 would open up people's eyes, allow everybody who has been victimized as far as trafficking and domestic violence to be seen or helped. So I'll stick by 124 in its raw form.
Yes. And for those who haven't had a chance to look at this bill language, please let us know. We're happy to share earlier versions. But the most beautiful thing about what April is talking about is that the bill didn't propose what happened. It didn't say, if this, then you must that. What the bill said was, ask why. You must ask why. You must ask about the trauma. You must ask about the victimization. You must look and consider all of these things. Consider the whole person as a prosecutor when you offer that plea, as a judge when you decide what enhancement to impose, when you decide where in the guidelines to sentence somebody. So it was all about presenting the full picture, presenting the why, presenting the humanity, and then letting the system do what it needs to do the justice that it says it does, right? So that was the most beautiful piece about that bill, is that we weren't prescriptive. And it's going to make me tear up, because April, every time you talk about that, it makes me tear up. So hopefully we'll keep fighting. I know we're going to keep fighting to get every single piece of that relief, whether it takes another year, another 2 years, another 5 years, or like New York takes us another 10 years. But I know every single person who's here is here because they care, because they want to keep fighting. Our panelists, every single attendee who's here. So we're so grateful. If you would like to know more, please go to our website. Our former trainings are there. Our upcoming trainings are there. We're going to do 3 more trainings to talk about the bill more specifically, talk about vacature, the expansion, talk about what Kate was talking about, how to interview your clients, how to put things together, how to present mitigation packets in the most impactful way. That will be led by a public defender from San Diego on January 13th. And we're just so grateful. So please come join us. And if you have any questions for anybody here, send them to me, and I will be happy to make sure they're answered and get back to each of you. So thank you for your time, and we hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you, everybody. And thank you to all our panelists.
Thank you, Pallavi. I heard your heart, and I appreciate that. Like I always say, it's because of you guys and your fight that allowed me to be so courageous and tell my story every day. So thank you.